Kia ora tātou, nā mai ara mai, I nei kuihuinga, ki te whakarongo ki tēnei rangatira, Donna, narrated Donna, ka te mi ki a koe o mātauranga, whare tēnei ki wane nui a mātou, I tēnei wā, o te rā kia koutou, kei honei, e tautupu nei I tēnei kaupapa, tēnā koutou katoa, huri no ki te epurangi kia koutou I rungi to Zoom, koutou katoa. Welcome along to our Tōmai Ora seminar for today. And firstly, I probably have to just send apologies from those people who can't be here for us. So we've got Annika Anderson, who would normally be introducing our speaker and running the session, Paparangi, Reid, as well as some others from our team who are all, sadly, over in Australia at the Lewitcha conference. So they're a great time over in Canada. Yeah. No doubt sad they can't be here with us. But we've got an awesome crew here, and yeah, it's not the quantity, it's the quality, obviously, that matters. And so great to see some new faces and old faces. And by that I mean just good friends rather than any comment on your age. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Donna. Really pleased to be able to introduce Donna. And I don't think Donna needs any real introduction to any of us here. But she's a well-known colleague within TKHM, but also Te Rangaho Haere Pōmari at the University of Otago, and many other hats, you know, including this being an expert around this area of Māori Data Sovereignty. And so today, really looking forward to Kōrero going to talk to us about collective and relational approaches to the datafication of Māori lives. So yeah, really looking forward to it, Donna, and I'm sure everyone else is too.
Tēnei tui kia koutou, kua huhu ātinona mai, hurangi mai, te rānei. Ko Donna Cormack hau, he uri tēnei no Kāi Tahu no Kāti Māmoe. So kia ora, thank you everyone for coming along. Yeah, so I am going to talk a little bit today about collective and relational approaches to datafication. I have been doing work, I guess, for a long time around ethnicity data and ethnicity data classification and measurement, but then more recently have been really interested in issues around data justice and data harms within the particular context of Māori data sovereignty and Indigenous data sovereignty, and it's great to see some work in that space as well in the room. And so I am involved with Te Mana Raraunga, which is a Māori Data Sovereignty Network, as well as GIDA, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. But because those sort of networks, like a community of practice, I guess, we kind of aren't speaking as representatives of those groups, that's a network of thinking about these issues. And what I wanted to talk about today is some of the ways in which our current experiences and practices of data as Māori are kind of antithetical to a collective relational approach to data and tend to kind of reify or reinforce colonial logics around data. And so I want to think a little bit around how we conceptualize data rights and interests, how we talk about data harm, and I'm also going to be informed today by a report that I was involved with that was recently released a week or two ago by Te Kāwhi Raraunga, so the Māori Data Governance Model, which came out of the Mana Oriti agreement, which was an agreement between Te Kāti that we, the entity that was formed from the data ILG of the Iwi Chairs Forum and their relationship with Statistics New Zealand around conceptualising and developing a model for governance of data. And in line with Kaupapa Māori citational practices, at the start of the talk, I just want to acknowledge the collective nature of the things that I'm talking about, and in particular some of the people who've influenced my talk today. So Tahu Kukutai, Kiko by Kaide, Stephanie, Lisa Carroll, Maggie Walter and others. Kitty's in the room. Working in the IDS space, ongoing conversations and theorising with Hannah Burgess, Paula King and Jack Adamoana, and the work of Wana Jackson, Annie Heidi, Linda Smith, Ruha, Benjamin, Catherine McKittrick and Bruce Gilmore. Yeah, so just get into it. I thought it would be useful to start with explaining what I mean by a datafied society, or this concept. Oh, review of maybe everything. Put me in the corner. Yeah, so we know that observation or what I probably conceptualize as surveillance and measurement and classification are a central element of colonialism, and they're a persistent everyday experience for Māori, and in fact the construction of Indigenous peoples as objects rather than subjects is critically implicated in the dehumanisation of Indigenous peoples that underpinned imperial colonial projects of expansion, extraction and invasion. And Tahu and I have written about that elsewhere around how observation, measurement, monitoring and surveillance is linked not only to language practices or to discursive practices of categorisation, but to material incursions into the lives of Indigenous communities. So the idea of being measured and counted and categorised is not a new thing for Indigenous peoples, but datafication is a kind of particular term that's come into use maybe in the last 10 or so years. And it's to talk about the way in which things are made into data. So things in our everyday life, our relationships, our experiences, how many steps we take, how many friends we have, they've also become things that are quantified in our everyday life to produce as in this quote here, this continual source of data. And so it's more than just producing data, it's the idea with producing data to sort of do something with it, to kind of measure and tabulate and analyse the world. And so if we think about how that plays out in health, we can kind of think about things like how we're encouraged to be involved in the own datafication of our lives through things like monitoring our steps or other sorts of tracking and surveillance tools. I know that Kitty, you've written about this a bit in your PhD around sort of datafication of, I'm thinking about the socks, you know, the measuring a baby's body temperature with socks. So these ways of continually sort of tracking and measuring and quantifying aspects of our health, but in a very specific conceptualization of what health is. And sometimes we know that datafication is happening, but it's also happening in increasingly passive ways, or ways that are kind of blurry or not really clear to us. So if we think of how our kind of internet browsing, for example, what pages we go to, how long we spend on those pages, they're tracked in ways that we're not always aware of. So it's not that the measurement, the observation, the idea that we can quantify people's lives, that's new, but different advances in technology, the increasing digitisation of all forms of information allow for it to happen in a much larger scale, and it's become much more pervasive with things like smartphones and wearable devices. But as I said earlier, the logics that underpin datafication embody Western positivist neoliberal approaches to data. So data are still conceived of as somehow objective, as neutral and value free, and often as kind of static and stable. Like it has this idea that it retains its meaning, even if the context or our understanding of what that data was that we collected has changed rapidly. We still tend to use data collected historically as if it's got some sort of static, stable nature. And my thinking around sort of reductionist orientations to the world, influenced by Hannah's work in her PhD, where she talks about how reductionism reduces the world from a complex, interconnected, dynamic world to individual data points. And it sees that as the way that we can get to really understanding things by reducing things down, by separating them out, by dividing them up as individual data points, and then sometimes regrouping them up. So our understanding becomes the sum of kind of individual data points. And that's in real contrast to a whakapapa understanding of the world, which recognises how everything is interrelated and interdependent, and emphasises sort of ontology or a way of being that's grounded in our wholeness rather than in our parts. And Moana Jackson powerfully reminds us of that in that quote from one of his Ngāti notes when he says, "You cannot be part of Whakapuna." So this real different orientation to the world is the way of coming to understanding and knowing how things relate and connect to each other, rather than reducing things down to the smaller and smaller parts, and then kind of reconstructing them to try to understand something complex. So I guess the point I'm probably labouring at this stage is that we often talk about datafication as if it's a new phenomenon, but I think for Indigenous people it's an old phenomenon that plays out in particular ways with new technology. And so here I think of the quote that Amy Sazier has in Discourses on Colonialism, where he's defining colonialism as basically signification, which to me is datafication, like he was talking about that in the 1950s, that actually that a fundamental part of colonialism is reducing things to objects, to signifying, and I think that's what we do to people's lives in some ways in a datafied society. So I wanted to think a little bit, and I'm sorry if you can hear for answers, but sorry, I think I just really wanted I think it's something we need to have space to talk about with each other. And so I wanted to, I guess, raise some of the things that I'm thinking about, and I know other people are thinking about it in the data space as well. What does it mean when groups or collectives are created through data? So that's something that increasingly happens. Tahu's written about this a little bit as well, and big linked data sets like the IDI can create relationships and identify kind of connections between people that they might not want us to know about. They can place people in households or communities or groups. So this kind of process of creating groups or collectives through data, when most of any protections, and they're quite limited, that we have are really about individuals and not really about groups. And what is it? And just, I guess, encouraging us to talk and think about how we can move beyond the current sort of data practices that are still really centred on individuals, and think about ways in which we can enact a collective approach to data. So in New Zealand, we do recognise data rights, and it's still pretty limited, the places that we do acknowledge that people have rights in relation to data, or where we acknowledge or talk about data harm. It's generally not in relation to any sort of collective right. And so this is from a paper that Tahu Kukutai and colleagues have written. It came out, I think, in March, so a very recent report on Māori and privacy, and using privacy as the example, they talk about how the way in which privacy is thought about in relation to data in New Zealand is very individualised, and this is fundamentally different from an Indigenous orientation, which would be always balancing collective rights, harms, potential to benefit, collective privacy against alongside, against makes it sound like they're always in competition, but alongside individual rights. And that processes are driven by values that are not about commodification or profit or that they shouldn't be. I don't know that we could say that all Māori data isn't going down that track, but that they should be generative and restorative rather than kind of that extractive, accumulative model of data. And so this is just an example from the Privacy Act. So the Privacy Act was its latest sort of version in 2020. So there was an opportunity to think more broadly about, so if we use privacy as an example, to think more about what a collective right might be, what collective privacy or group privacy might be, but they pretty much just stuck with the old conceptualization that the only right you have in relation to privacy is individual right around personal data. And so they say personal information only is information about an identifiable individual. So it doesn't engage really at all with the idea that there can be privacy about a group or a collective, but also that personal information may also have privacy implications for other people. So something that's about you might also be giving information about people you're related to or in relationship with. And so even though collective concepts and considerations were raised, there was no real engagement. And the same in the Statistics Act. But there's still, in the limited sort of legislation and regulatory frameworks that we have around data and rights and benefit, there's not really any examples, I don't think, of an acknowledgement of collective rights. And so we're not even getting to the point of sort of talking through, well, what would they look like? How would we operationalize them? How would we protect them? How would we conceptualize collective harm from data? And so in the broader data justice space, people are talking about these issues. This is a definition of data harm that I like, and it comes from Joanna Redden and colleagues at the Data Justice Lab in Kāti. And they identify that you can have harm from data processes and practices that doesn't just set back a person or impair or impact on a person, but it can, they use the term entity, but I think there you could substitute that for community or collective or broader society's interest. So the way in which we think about the harm that can come from poor data practices, misuse of data, privacy breaches, lack of consent, hasn't really engaged with that idea of harm at the level of the collective, or certainly not at the level of sort of society's interest. And so I was thinking of some examples of that. One of them that again is sort of an area we've been thinking about. Both of them, first ones are related to DNA, and I think it's because it's one of those obvious examples where we can see that information from someone's DNA tells us that it has information that's more than related just to them as an individual. But also because there's already harm happening from the way in which DNA data is used. So one of the examples when we were running the submission for DNA, the use of DNA in forensic investigation, there's not a lot of regulation, very out of state legislation for that in New Zealand, so the police and ESR are actually able to kind of be relatively unscrewed, I think, just like word, kind of do what they want, because the legislation was written at a time when sorts of things that you're able to do now weren't really around. And so the use of samples of DNA to identify relatives and investigation is something that I was thinking of. It came out recently in the media, but it's a practice that's been relatively long-standing. So that's an area we need to think about. Even if an individual did consent to give a sample, that actually has implications for their family or their relatives. And that I don't know that those kind of potential collective impacts are always, I doubt that they're disclosed at the time that the sample is taken. And so, yeah, I guess that's one example in forensics. But in health, it kind of can operate in a similar way. So even though I think there's more understanding maybe in the healthcare setting that genetic information gives you information about more than just the individual in front of you, we haven't actually, or I'm not aware of it, but Camilla, you might know if there is anything happening. We haven't developed really good processes around any sort of form of collective consent. And I'm not sure that we always are able to identify for people who are involved either in DNA because it's related to their healthcare or because that it's part of a research project, what the risks for them are as both an individual but also for the collective. So I think about projects that are kind of explicitly recruiting from one hapu or one region, and what that means to collect data, DNA samples on like a large proportion of a kind of interrelated population in terms of how identifiable it kind of makes everyone in that population potentially, but also the implications of things like if a certain outcome or genetic variant or allele gets identified as being associated with that group, what that means for sort of the stigmatization and marginalization potentially of a group who may have absolutely not wanted to ever be associated with or involved with that research. And some of those risks are higher in smaller population groups. So, and the risks can lead to things like overseas increases in insurance premiums for people from particular groups, because that group, there's been an association for that group with particular health risks or the denial of insurance. So I think we need to both, as people in health and health researchers, have a much more nuanced understanding of what the kind of collective harm could be alongside sort of the purported collective benefit that's often the rationale for involving people in genetic research, and be really good at explaining those to community. But we also, I don't know, I think it's really interesting to think about what does it mean if half of the community says no and half says yes, but the information from the half that says yes actually tells you a whole lot about the half that says no, and the sort of moral and ethical issues that we haven't really grappled with, I don't think, in any sort of significant or meaningful way. The other area that I've been thinking a lot about, and probably from the thinking that and the writing I've been doing with Jack around algorithmic harm, is even when data is collected, so an individual might consent to providing their data, or they might have provided consent that was bundled in with access to a service for future research. But then if that data is used to build an algorithm, and then that algorithm is used in a way that actually means that their community has access to a service or has a poor outcome, that there's a collective harm that can result from that as well. That's kind of a harm to your group through providing your data. So again, I think that's an area in research where there's not a good understanding of algorithmic harm in general, but there's also the way the consent process works, the consent sort of at the level of the individual's data collection, if consent occurs, and it's not really tied, there's no sort of re-consenting process. Want this data to be used in an algorithm. I don't even know what that would look like, but I think people would be horrified. Well, I know that I would have, my data was used to build an algorithm that then restricted access for people to a service based on some association between being Māori and the outcome in the data. And we know that that's happening, like it's not a hypothetical situation. So those sorts of examples, and there's lots more, but I thought those were some that I've been thinking about, in particular in the research and service delivery space. They tend to use that are being defined externally. So when we're talking about in these contexts, that Māori is usually defined by some sort of Crown or Crown agency classification system, or externally by researchers as a population. And this is in real contrast to the way in which we would define ourselves. So I think I wanted to make the point, I guess, that when I'm talking about collective rights, I see them as, for Māori, they relate to the way in which we would self-define our collectives. And so that part of one of our collective rights is the right to self-define, to self-determine who we are, and that we've always had collective rights that have been asserted in things like e whakaputanga and SBT and local reaffirmed in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the collective rights that are talked about in there that are quite, well, they're all relevant, but if we think about the right to be involved in decision making about things that affect you, and the fundamental right to free, prior and informed consent, as it appears in the UN draft, is a collective right, because the whole declaration is framed in relation to collective rights. And in the Māori Data Sovereignty context as well, one of the collective rights are talked about in a couple of places, but one of the key ones is in the principle of whanaungatanga, where it talks about there is always this consideration of collective rights alongside individual rights. I think one thing that I find interesting when we talk about collective versus, well, even I just said then collective and individual rights, particularly in the context of sort of our institutional ethics approach, is there's always an assumption that they're going to be in conflict. But I think if you, I don't know that we know that they are always in conflict. I think that's a flawed assumption, and that's probably racist. It's got sort of those elements of racism about the idea of kind of individual agency being like the kind of superior way to be as a human, I guess, that you would think that then the aspirations or the values of the collective would always be in conflict with those of the individual. So I think some people, when we've tried to have conversations about this, it's hard for people to get past that idea. And I just realized I keep doing it myself, because we talk about collective and individual rights as if they're always oppositional, rather than a lot of the time they might actually be working kind of in concert. And then I'm sure there are processes for what happens in a context where there might be a difference between an individual, what they want to do, and kind of what the wishes of the collective are. But I feel like we haven't even got to that point of thinking, well, what would that look like in a kind of ethical consenting process? Because we tend to, well, not we, but they tend to be positioned as kind of irreconcilable. And so I'm reading through. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which I think some of the thinking that's part of the recent Māori Data Governance Model was useful for helping us to have conversations with each other. And here I'm thinking about conversations that we can have as Māori about how we can have more collective relational approaches to data and data practices. So just as a little bit of a background, so as I said earlier, and sorry, it's a little bit explained, this data governance model was sort of the outcome of quite a long process. So one of the parts of the Mana Auditi agreement was that there would be a co-development of a governance model around how Māori data is governed or cared for, kind of in the official statistical system. And there was I won't go into all of it, but the information's on Te Kahui Rauranga's website, the process of sort of co-design and workshops over a period of time, then the forming of a ohu, which was to write a model, and the taking over of the writing of the model, the writing of the model was kind of taken over by the Māori members of Te Ohu. Te Ohu. So that's Tahu, Kukutai, Kiko, Whanau, me, Caleb, Moses. Shouldn't have started the list because now I can't remember them, but I'll shout out to them at the end. And it was originally conceptualized, I guess, as a model for Māori governance, but in doing the work, what we really wanted and what some of us, I guess, who don't have much faith in, based on the track record of the Crown, was a document that would be useful for Māori communities to think through some of these issues, irrespective, and this is me, my position, irrespective of whether or not the Crown engages with the model at all. Hopefully this gives a bit of a framework to think through some of these issues. And so you can see, even though the original focus was on governance of Māori data, that what we want to talk about as much, if not more, is Māori systems, so the mana motu hake part, so the data that sits and the systems that can sit outside of current structures that we have. So part of the way that we thought through issues was having data po. There was an explicit decision, just I don't remember what I'm studying, or not, to not use Māori values in the po because of the risk of appropriation or misuse of those values. People using them in ways they didn't understand what the value was or couldn't do that. We see happening all the time in the institutions. But in the data infrastructure po, one of the so it's kind of talking about what's the infrastructure that we need to kind of realize a different future for Māori data. One of the things in here where I think we can have a much more collective relational approach to data is by encouraging us to have more distributed and decentralized, the more localized data systems. So having data as close to the people or the communities that it comes from. If we have localized systems, that encourages more localized governance. It means that the people who know and are working with the data are much more likely to be in relation with the people whose data it is, if not their own data. It's more contextualized because people also understand the context of the community where the data comes from. And I think we saw examples of the importance of that really contextualized, localized knowledge during COVID, when the centralized models that were stood up, like the kind of contact tracing at a national level, were never going to work in the same way that like some, iwi providers or whānau water providers or other people who were deeply embedded in the community, they knew the community in a way that a centralized system, well, it's not safe for the community, for the centralized system often to have some of that information, but we're able to respond in much more appropriate ways because that knowledge was available at local levels. And so I think that doesn't mean that we can't share knowledge and link knowledge, but it means that we we don't have to do that by putting it all into these massive data repositories and centralizing it. And we certainly don't have to interact with data that might be useful from the Crown by having our data integrated into their data sets. We can get their data out if we wanted and link it to our data sets. And so I think that's an area where there's a lot of potential for us to think about. Really pushing back against that kind of centralization, which is really, I think, an manifestation of kind of universalism. So this idea that things are better if they're large and centralized, and that you could have a system that would be applicable and appropriate for every community, which is in real contrast, I think, to a Kāi Tahu approach, which is it should be embedded, it should be localized, it should be contextualized. And then you've got to add another whole layer when we offshore all of that data as well. I think we can think about distributed and decentralized in terms of our relationships with other Indigenous communities as well. So if we did want to offshore data, so have data stored over there, we could develop or nurture relationships with Indigenous data repositories or Indigenous communities. So again, we don't have to put it with Amazon. We don't have to put it with, yeah, there are ways that I think we can think about having data practices and processes that align more with our values and make it easier to kind of have a level of collective governance, which is easier, I think, if it's localized. The other way that the other point that I wanted to make is under the data collection PO, we talk a little bit about the importance of only taking the data that you need and returning the data that you don't need. And I think for me, that is another example of a different approach to data that encourages us to really think about the collective impacts, or the impacts, I guess, on collectives of our current data practices. So what does it mean to kind of have this approach to data that, because we can collect it, we will, this kind of mass accumulation approach, in terms of not only kind of perpetuating that sort of surveillance mentality that's part of colonialism, but the environmental impacts of kind of mass accumulation of data. And so that's a different kind of data harm, but I'm just thinking about what it means to have massive data warehouses on stolen land in other people's countries. So kind of what it means for us to have most of our data stored in Australia, and the environmental impacts for the Indigenous peoples here. Let alone, I guess, they just get resources from Amazon to drain swamps here for the data warehouses. So it's broadening out, I guess, our idea of collective harm, and thinking also about things like our relationship with the environment and our need to think about harm and benefit in different ways. I think I might wrap up soon, other than kind of what I wanted to say, that I think the best option for us to radically alter current thinking around data is to invest in minimal systems. So it's useful to understand what's happening in the Kāwanatanga space, because it does have real, from those examples, you can see it has real everyday impacts and does cause harm to people. But I think the potential for like a radical alternative is in the mana motuhake space, and not trying to fix some of those systems which are so deeply invested in kind of neoliberal individual logic, and continue to develop our own systems and think about ways that we can be in relation with data and be in relation with our collectives, so that there is actually benefit from a lot of the things that are happening at the moment with data, and if nothing else, it's less likelihood of harm. And I just wanted to finish we talk about these issues in a paper that we teach here around Māori quantitative approaches, and so that's Sarah Jane and I, although Sarah Jane taught it this year, and one of the activities, sorry, it's not really an activity, it's a compulsory assessment, is a reading reflection, and so Jack's is in the room trying to look the other way. This is a poem that she wrote as part of her reflection, and I thought I'd just want to, with her permission, to finish with this poem, which is really an encouragement for us to do, for us to turn, I guess, our attention and our focus to the mana motuhake, the systems that we can build about that. I want to read a poem, which is like, I think what I spent my whole school life trying to avoid doing, but I'm going to read a poem in front of everyone. No, it's not showing up properly. Can't see the top line on my screen. I'll just open it. Apologies if I don't do it justice. To be counted, to be controlled, to be counted, to be compared, to be counted, to be conscripted, prescripted, convicted, to be counted, to be censored, sent, ordered, to be coerced, to be considered, Māori, Pacific, other, to be classified, glassy-eyed, to be IDI, tiered, to be simplified, feared, to be counted, to be cited, and deficit data, defunction, deliberated, dead and dying, surviving to be cited, refused to be cited, you know where the facts are, to be counted, to be claimed, calculated for chairs and debating chambers, so that Māori men can fight over who gets to take your seat and use your voice to make changes, to be counted, to be courted, high-courted, band-courted, courtroomed, ordered, court being Māori, to be counted, to be discounted, to be counted, to be dismissed, to be counted, to be displayed, misplaced, replayed, to be counted, counted, and counted again, only to be undercounted still. Shouldn't we just count on ourselves? Kia ora.